The question is that the document be noted. I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I disagree with the views that have been expressed by the member for Chifley and with the report of the committee. In my view, the inquiry has offered no satisfactory basis for Australia persisting with a 1:36 cabin crew ratio when a 1:50 ratio is recommended by major aircraft manufacturers Boeing and Airbus and is the regulatory requirement in the United States, Europe and other jurisdictions. The member for Chifley spoke about reaching a decision based on an assessment of the evidence, and that is a good principle. I think all of us on the committee have a very strong incentive to be satisfied as to matters of aviation safety and security. In this business, we spend as much time in aircraft as people in just about any other occupation, and so therefore we will have a very strong interest in getting the best possible aviation safety and security outcomes, and that was certainly very much at the top of my mind as I considered the evidence before the committee. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my assessment, the right way to frame the question which faced this inquiry was to ask whether there is any good reason for the cabin crew ratio used in Australia to diverge from the 1:50 ratio which is used in other developed nations and recommended by the aircraft manufacturers. In thinking about this question, it is also relevant that the Commonwealth specialist regulator in this area, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, proposes a 1:50 ratio. It is relevant that single-aisle aircraft in the relevant size range, such as the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737, are designed on the basis of a 1:50 ratio, and it is relevant that in the US and Europe, and in fact all international civil aviation organisation jurisdictions except Australia and Canada, 1:50 is the ratio used. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. If there is persuasive evidence that countries which use the 1:50 ratio have inferior aviation safety or security outcomes to those in Australia, or if there is any tangible evidence that Australia's use to date of the 1:36 ratio has delivered tangible and practical benefits for safety or security, then we should have no hesitation in continuing to apply the 1:36 ratio. In my view, however, if there is no such evidence, we should adopt the international practice of the 1:50 ratio. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I weighed up the evidence, it was clear to me that the committee received no persuasive evidence that using the 1:50 ratio produces inferior safety or security outcomes. At the outset, let us recognise that Australia has very high aviation safety standards, and that reflects many different factors, including maintenance practices, pilot training and quality, aircraft age and quality, air traffic control systems and weather. The number of cabin crew is one factor in a complex mix. It will be relevant in some situations, and particularly where there is an accident which requires a rapid evacuation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the committee asked the regulator, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, whether there is evidence to its knowledge of systematic differences between aviation safety in Australia and other countries due to the different cabin crew ratios. In its submission and the evidence to the inquiry, the authority noted that it had not been able to find any evidence and it had no knowledge of any accident or accident investigation or incident investigation in a country that uses the 1:50 ratio that has recommended an increase in the cabin crew ratio. CASA noted that it is not aware of any studies into cabin safety that have recommended an increase in the cabin crew ratio. It noted the absence, to its knowledge, of any evidence supporting a link between the Australian requirement for one cabin attendant to 36 passengers and Australia's aviation safety record. And it noted the absence to its knowledge of any situation where it's been demonstrated that the effective management of an event was enhanced as a consequence of the cabin crew ratio on that flight being 1:36. Madam Deputy Speaker, I take from that, consistent with the principle rightly advanced by the member for Chifley, that we ought to adopt an evidence-based approach, that an evidence-based approach does not provide support for Australia diverging from the ratio recommended by manufacturers and the ratio used in most comparable jurisdictions of 1:50. Of course, as has been noted, since 2006, CASA has given exemptions to a number of operators, allowing them to operate using the 1:50 ratio. So this is not merely a hypothetical matter. We actually have evidence of the practice in Australia, and we received no persuasive evidence based upon that practice having been in place for the last 5 years of any materially adverse safety consequences. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the other issues that was thrown into the terms of reference for this review was aviation security. The advice that the committee received from the Office of Transport Security was, in answer to the question, is it correct that the aviation security considerations do not assist us and do not point in either direction, that's to say, do not point in favour of either 1:36 or 1:50. The advice from the senior officer of the Office of Transport Security who appeared before the committee was as follows: on the evidence that is available, that would be a fair assessment. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my view, therefore, based upon the evidence that I had the opportunity to hear and to read as a member of the committee, it is clear that there is no persuasive basis for concluding that the use of a 1:50 ratio delivers any inferior safety outcome as compared to a 1:36 ratio. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, there were a range of other arguments put to the committee, and for completeness, they ought to be addressed here. The first argument that was put as to why we ought to maintain the 1:36 ratio is because that is the ratio that Australia has historically had. I do not think that is a very good argument. I do not think it is a very good argument to say we've always had 1:36, so we should maintain 1:36. That was, in my perception, a subtext of some of what was argued, but it is a poor basis for reaching a conclusion in this important question of public safety and public security. Madam Deputy Speaker, we then heard a range of arguments from the Transport Workers Union and the Flight Attendants Association of Australia. May I say that I am mystified as to why the Transport Workers Union was even called to appear before this committee. When the Secretary of the Transport Workers Union, Mr Tony Sheldon, appeared before the committee, I sought some guidance from him as to the particular expertise or competence that the Transport Workers Union might have on matters of aviation safety and security. I asked what role the members of the Transport Workers Union perform on an aircraft, and Mr Sheldon, under questioning, conceded that there are no TWU members who have any in-flight role. It is therefore quite unclear to me why the committee heard from the Transport Workers Union. Of course, any citizen, any group, any association is welcome to put submissions to parliamentary committees. Of course they are, and that is to be encouraged. But the question is whether the views of the Transport Workers Union are infused with any particular expertise. Madam Deputy Speaker, my conclusion on this matter is that they are not, and I can only speculate as to the arcane arrangements and relationships between the Australian Labor Party and the Transport Workers Union, which led to us hearing such extensive evidence from the Transport Workers Union. Madam Deputy Speaker, we also heard from the Flight Attendants Association of Australia, and I acknowledge that the Flight Attendants Association presented arguments based on safety and security considerations. as I have noted in my minority report, I found those arguments less persuasive than the evidence provided on the same points by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and the Office of Transport Security. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is one other issue I would like to address before I conclude my remarks on this important topic, and that is the question of whether it is a bad thing that the airlines, in seeking this change, were motivated by the fact that it would deliver cost savings if the regulations were changed so that they were required now to comply with a cabin crew ratio of 1 to 50 rather than the previous requirement of a ratio of 1 to 36. The majority report at paragraph 1.71 speaks of, quotes, the challenges in assessing operators' motivations in seeking exemptions to the 1 to 36 ratio, close quotes, and notes the operators had agreed that their motivation had been primarily for cost reasons. This is presented in the majority report as if it is in some way prima facie evidence of guilt, Madam Deputy Speaker. The paragraph seems to suggest that it is in some way a matter for concern that operators have been motivated by cost savings. Let me make it clear that I disagree. Of course, safety must be the primary objective. Operators must not do anything which compromises safety. Safety is an absolute good in the conducting of an airline business. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, if cost savings can be obtained without compromising safety, I see no objection at all to operators pursuing cost savings. This is a question to be assessed on the evidence. Does the adoption of a 1 to 50 ratio rather than a 1 to 36 ratio cause detriment to safety and security? And in the absence of evidence that it does, then I, for one, see nothing inherently wrong with the pursuit of cost savings. But let me make the point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that if cost savings are obtained from this measure or indeed anything else, and again emphasising that the absolute objective must be safety and savings should only be sought and obtained if safety is not compromised, but let me emphasise, or let me repeat the point, that if cost savings are obtained, amongst the benefits that might follow from that would be lower airfares, making it affordable for more Australians to fly. It's possible that cost savings might improve the break-even economics of particular routes to particular destinations, particularly in rural and remote areas, and it therefore might allow services which would not otherwise be possible. And of course, the other possibility is that the cost savings obtained by changing the cabin crew ratio might be used to fund other initiatives which have a greater safety and security benefit than is gained from diverging from the international standard ratio of 1 to 50 and continuing to use the once-off and stand-alone Australian ratio of 1 to 36. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an important question of public safety and security. It is a question which is to be assessed based upon the evidence. I'm pleased to say that all sides are in agreement on that proposition. Where we are in disagreement is the conclusions to be drawn from the evidence. As I heard the evidence, as I read the submissions, as I asked questions of witnesses, the test which I sought to apply is to find whether there is any persuasive evidence that countries which use the internationally standard ratio of 1 to 50 have inferior aviation safety or security outcomes to those in Australia, or conversely, evidence that Australia's use to date of the 1 to 36 ratio has delivered tangible practical benefits for safety and security. Madam Deputy Speaker, I found no such evidence, and on that basis I was very comfortable in concluding, and in doing so as somebody who spends quite a lot of time on airlines, I was very comfortable in concluding that Australia should move to adopting the international standard 1 to 50 ratio.